Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good day to us all. Good morning from Jakarta, and perhaps for some of you, it's already a very good afternoon. I sincerely hope that everyone is safe and well amidst the pandemic that we are all fighting at this moment. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to our event today. Let's talk about Papua, Key Historical and Legal Facts webinar. I'm Indah Nuria Savitri, Deputy Director for Civil and Political Rights at the Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs Directorate, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, and I will be your host today. Allow me to take this opportunity to also welcome all our distinguished speakers to the webinar, to His Excellency Mr. Tharyat, Advisor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs on Human Rights, Law and Security, as well as His Excellency Dr. Damos Dumoli Agusman, the Director General for Legal Affairs and International Treaties of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We are also graced by the presence of His Excellency Mr. Freddy Numberi, Papuan Consultative Council Advisor, as well as Ms. Lisa Main from Judith Neilson Institute, and Dr. Richard Chauvel, the Melbourne University Indonesian History Professor, as well, of course, Mr. Tama Salim, the Jakarta Post editor, who will be moderating our discussion today. Distinguished participants, we are of the view that this webinar will serve as a platform for healthy discussion among different stakeholders regarding some key historical and legal facts about Papua. Various narratives have been debated over the years, and different perspectives of international laws being present and deliberated as well. And therefore today we are trying to revisit and take a closer look at those notions in order to get a clearer and more comprehensive understanding towards these issues. Because of course, these different narratives and narration brought its own dynamics at the international as well as national level, and in various platforms as well, including media and social media, which unfortunately are not always correct or nor accurate. So distinguished participants, it has been a staunch position of the Indonesian government that Papua is lawfully an integral part of Indonesia since 1945. And whenever we talk about the history of Papua and Indonesia, there will be several triggering events, concepts, timelines, terminologies, as well as principles coming along. And to obtain a comprehensive understanding on this very important issue, and to speak in the broader sense, I think a review and thorough discussion of history must be attended by relevant legal notions surrounding the complete history of Indonesian statehood. So today, together with Jakarta Post, as part of the We Talk Show series initiated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, we bring together all distinguished experts on this particular issue to further discuss and bring better understanding about the factual, historical, and legal aspects of Papua. And we sincerely hope that we can focus on the main theme of today's discussion, which highlights that key historical and legal aspects again. And of course, now let me welcome Mr. Tama Salim, the Jakarta Post editor, who will be our moderator today. Pak Tama, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Indah. Good day, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world. We would like to wish everyone who is tuning in today a good health and safety in these trying times. We would also like to thank Bu Indah for opening our webinar, as well as all our esteemed speakers for taking part. It is our hope that the discussion today will be open and insightful. So for those of you just joining us, this is the 33rd Jakarta Post Up Close webinar in collaboration with the Foreign Ministry. And the topic we will broach in the next 2 hours is one I'm certain has been on many people's minds and is grabbing headlines: Papua. Encompassing Indonesia's easternmost provinces, Papua and West Papua, the region has been part of the country since the proclamation of independence in 1945, according to historical and legal records. But just like Indonesia's struggle for independence in the past, Papua's legal status had become the subject of various interpretations based on various interests. Today, we hope to discern what about it is fact and opinion. I'm Tama Salim, editor at the Jakarta Post, and I will be your host for today. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping to get out of the way first. First of all, this webinar will be done in English, and sadly, we won't have Indonesian translation at this time, but we do have excellent sign language interpreters, so today's talks can be followed by a wider audience. Secondly, we have 4 wonderful speakers today, and each will have 10 to 15 minutes for their presentation. The shorter the presentations, the more time we will have for the Q&A session afterwards. I will remind each speaker 5 minutes before the end of their turn. Speaking of which, we expect to have about 30 to 40 minutes for the Q&A session. In the meantime, anyone tuning in on Zoom is welcome to post their questions in our Q&A box. The panelists will answer you directly or address the questions during this session. But due to time constraints, we will cluster similar ones together and flag them to our speakers. Without further ado, let us begin this webinar with a keynote speech from Mr. Tharyat, Senior Advisor to the Foreign Minister on Human Rights, Law, and Security. Pak Tri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pak Tama, Bu Indah. A very good morning, afternoon, and evening, and selamat pagi to all distinguished speakers and participants of this webinar. Let me begin by conveying our highest appreciation to the Jakarta Post for the solid collaboration for this initiative. I wish also to welcome warmly our distinguished speakers, Pak Ambassador Freddy Numberi, Pak Richard Chauvel, Ibu Lisa Main, and Pak Ambassador Damos Agusman for your valuable time to share your views with us. From their quality, I'm very sure that this will be a very compelling discussion. We at the Foreign Ministry are always open for discussion on the topics of today's webinar and on other issues too. We note that even though the historical and legal aspects of Papua as part of the Republic of Indonesia are final and binding in the context of international law, frankly, I'm puzzled by the narrative spread in social media that persistently and unfoundedly portray that Papua is a colony of Indonesia. Even some mainstream media in Australia, New Zealand, and Europe oftentimes mistakenly writes that Indonesia annexed Papua in 1969. This cannot be further from the truth. Today's talk bring experts and scholars on the issue, where we hear about the factual history beginning on 17 August 1945, when we declared our independence, and through long negotiation process leading to the adoption of the unequivocal resolution on Papua in 1969 by the United Nations General Assembly. So why some still question these historical and legal facts? For those minority wanting to rule over Papua as their own kingdom, of course, the existing free and fair election process to democratically elect Papuan leaders stand in their way. Thus, they use their own version of history to further their political goals outside of the democratic process. But for those who genuinely cares and have an interest on the issue, perhaps there are still misperceptions and misunderstandings of both the historical and legal facts. And this may explain the common mistaken news report about the matter. Through this webinar and the network it builds, we trust that you can take away a number of information as it relates to the history and legal aspects of the matter. Was Papua part of the Dutch Indies before 1945? Was Papua given or returned to Indonesia in 1963? Did the Netherlands have the legal rights to retain control over Papua at the conclusion of the Roundtable Conference? Do Papuans have the right to self-determination? What is the purpose and legal meaning of the Act of Free Choice, or PEPRA? Was the PEPRA conducted correctly and in line with the 1962 New York Agreement? These are the many historical and legal questions which must firstly be comprehended on its own, and then linkages among them must also be understood. This is the very purpose of this webinar. That is very important to clearly understand what actually happened in the process, and also to understand the relevant legal consequences under international law to reach a correct and appropriate conclusion of the status of Papua. I'm very confident that this is one of our various efforts in building dialogue and understanding on Papua issues with the public here at home and internationally. At the same time, Indonesian government has poured its national resources to solve a number of challenges in Papua. And over the years, we have recorded Papua's poverty rate steadily decreasing, school enrollment up, more healthcare facilities available and affordable, infrastructure built, roads, bridges, ports, to name a few, democracy taking root and then blossoming, and the Human Development Index making gradual investment. However, we still have some challenges, particularly in terms of law enforcement and human rights. We note that despite of this, important progress is continuously being made, such as President Joko Widodo releasing a number of Papuan prisoners in 2015, the conviction of individuals guilty of racist acts in Surabaya in 2019, and more recently, the swift action taken by Indonesian military to dismiss and punish its 2 personnel for a case of abuse in Merauke. This is why, once again, ladies and gentlemen, it is so important for us to talk so that we can move forward and focus on building and advancing the provinces of Papua and West Papua. To make democracy serve its people better, its local governance in tune to the needs of the population, and a more just and safe environment, first, let us get our historical and legal facts right. Finally, I wish you all have a wonderful and fruitful webinar. Thank you so much, Mas Tama and Mbak Indah.
Thank you, Patri, for the keynote speech. As we have heard, there are historical and legal facts surrounding Papua that is already final and binding. And there are, media portrayals that are often inaccurate because of this, because of the different interests and in politics and whatever, and the views, perhaps the foreign views of what should be, the best for Papua. That said, efforts are underway to develop Papua, and we appreciate the government's increasing openness to discuss these challenges or even take responsibility, as is the case with the recent, developments as of 2 days ago. So now we will move on to our panel discussion. Our first speaker, Mr. Freddy Numberi, is a Papuan leader, a retired vice admiral and former governor of Papua, then known as Irian Jaya. Pak Freddy has also served in a number of ministerial positions between 1999 and 2011. Today, he will elaborate a bit on the journey of the Papuan people after the country's independence. The floor is yours, Pak Freddy. If you could unmute your speaker first, sir. Thank you. Very good.
Honorable speakers from Foreign Minister, Your Excellencies, Mr. Tharyat, and Mr. Damos, Dumoli Agusman, Mr. Richard Chauvel, Mr. Lisa May, all the other speakers, and the participants especially. Thanks for the time given to me. I try to elaborate further on this talk about Papua. The Papua dispute and the settlement is a long journey, long history. Until now, it's not yet finished because the explanation is not touching the real matters. Most of the Papuans doesn't know about history because most of the books we write explain to the children starting from the lower school, high school, university. They don't know about the story of Papua. And I think this is one of the homework of the Indonesian Minister of Foreign Affairs to work on this matter, to give the explanation right away to the Papuan people how the history, past history, and its settlement. The Netherlands laid claim to West New Guinea, Papua, by proclamation on 24 August 1828, 170 years before Indonesian independence, on 17 August 1945. This West New Guinea colony is claimed by King William I from the Netherlands and integrated to the government of the Netherlands East India in Batavia at the time, Jakarta nowadays. All the other colonies in Netherlands East India was handed over by the company, the business entity of the Dutch government, to the government in Batavia on 31st December 1799. When Indonesia formally obtained her freedom from the Dutch at the Round Table Conference in December 1949, Papua was the principal problem of the deliberations. The new agreement was signed by the Dutch and Indonesian on 15 August 1962. It was agreed that the United Nations would subsequently transfer administration of Papua to Indonesia. With the 5 years of this, a UN team was to return to assist Jakarta in organizing an act of self-determination in Papua. Its purpose was to determine whether the Papuans wish to become a part of Indonesia or choose independence outside of Indonesia. Next. Sweeping measures against the Dutch national, the origin of Papua dispute. Talking about these sweeping measures against Dutch nationals, on December 5th, 1957, the Indonesian government announced a series of sweeping measures against the Dutch nationalists and enterprises in Indonesia, which came as the culmination of an anti-Dutch strike and boycott campaign initiated with the government approval by Indonesian labor 3 days before. For this, Indonesian spokesmen have in fact stated that their government's new policies against the Dutch are the consequences of continued Dutch control of the dispute region, Papua. In this original decree, ordering all Dutchmen to leave Indonesia, December 5th, 1957, the Indonesian Minister of Justice, G. Maungkem, declared this measures was part of the Indonesian operation in the liberation of West Irian, West Papua, West New Guinea. And its recent memorandum to the members of the United Nations, Indonesia Permanent Mission to the UN declared, for example, that it should be understood that the recent development in Indonesia stem directly from the continuous dispute over Papua. The legal aspect legal aspect related to these matters, starting from the Linggadjati Agreement and so on, Rainfall Agreement and so on. Sovereignty through the Netherlands India is and shall remain with the Netherlands Kingdom until after a stated interval the Kingdom of the Netherlands transfer its sovereignty to the United States of Indonesia. All these legal matters actually didn't fulfill the consequences made by the Dutch itself. So the Dutch reaction to the legal claims put forth by Indonesia has focused in the first instance that the Roundtable Conference at the Hague transfer complete sovereignty to the United States of Indonesia unconditionally and irrevocably. The Roundtable Conference in the Hague, Article 2, that the status quo of the resident of New Guinea, Papua, in this case, shall be maintained with the stipulation that within a year from the date of transfer of sovereignty to the Republic of the United States of Indonesia. But this is also not fulfilled by the Dutch. Next. The Papua development itself. During that negotiation between the Indonesian side and the Dutch side, the Dutch government on the other side introduced the 10-year plan, the following plan, in the end of 1959. Her Majesty Queen Juliana, in her speech from the throne on 20 September 1960, stated that in the coming year, Netherlands New Guinea will enter an important new phase in its development towards self-determination. For as soon as the new New Guinea Council, which will consist in the main of representative of the native population, has been set up, administration and legislation will be possible only with cooperation of the Dutch. This speech is also supported by the governor. At 18 November 1961, the governor of Netherlands New Guinea, Papua, Peter J. Platel, issued a governor decree number 68 and 69 that the province of Netherlands New Guinea has its own flag. It's not a national flag, it's a cultural flag. And its own hymn. It's not a national anthem. So the Dutch still playing politics with Papua New Guinea, with Papua in this case. The next. During the negotiation part, after the Arafura incident on January 15, 1962, where Admiral Yosudarso with all his crew drowned Kri Macan Tutul because of heavy gunfight between the Dutch Navy and the Indonesian Navy, Sukarno put all pressure on the Dutch and prepared to go to war at any cost. By this commitment of Sukarno, Comer and Burundi, two military advisors of the Kennedy cabinet, talked to President Kennedy that according to this, to the US Ambassador Howard Jones in Jakarta at the time, President Sukarno already took all measures to go to war against the Dutch with the support of the Soviet Union. At that time, Indonesia Navy is the biggest navy in Southeast Asia, with the support of from the Soviet Union. President John F. Kennedy, with the report of his military advisors, make a secret letter to the Netherlands Prime Minister, Dr. J.D. Kwai, mentioned, I put this letter in my writings, in my about so maybe the moderator can show the letter to the audience, to the participants, the letter, secret letter from Kennedy. This would be a war on which neither the Netherlands nor the West would win any real sense. Whatever the outcome of particular military encounters, the entire free world position in Asia will be seriously damaged. Only the communists will benefit from such a conflict. It's time during the Cold War. I think the source is clear. With President Kennedy's letter, the Netherlands changed their minds and entered to discussion with Indonesia concerning this Papua dispute at the United Nations with the US facilitator to avoid war between Indonesia and the Netherlands. This letter, during the discussion of the Ambassador Howard Jones in Jakarta, he mentioned also that the war will be not happen in Netherlands or in Java or in Sumatra. The war will be happened in Papua. And an experience show, like the war between Japan and US, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki attack, most of the Japanese are killed. So is the example to Papua. When there is a war, it will be a war in Papua, where most of the Papuans were killed, because only 3,000 Dutch soldiers were at the time at the moment. Next.
You have 5 minutes left, sir.
Okay. New York Agreement. New York Agreement consists two parts: the transfer of Papua territory, the act of self-mutation after 6 years. Next. The May 96 handover. The 1st May 96 offer is only a de facto. The euro will be the United Nations resolution. Next. The joint statement. This is the one who changed that between the Dutch and the Indonesian, changed. The Indonesian Foreign Minister, Mr. Adam Malik, reiterated that the government position that for practical and technical reasons for the act of free choice, PEPERA, the Indonesian system of mutual consultation, musyawarah effort, the best procedure for Papua. So it changed the New York Agreement. And both sides agreed and signed on 21st May 1969. Next. The act of free choice, it happened. F has taken place in accordance with Indonesian practice, and it's likely a cancer growth on the side of the UN. My job is to really remove it. This is from Artisan. Next. John Salford, in his book United Nations and Indonesian Takeover was Papua, commented, Jakarta could convince most of the countries and UN of the anti-colonialism movement with America, which also anti-colonial. The Papua belongs to Indonesia. According to international principle, uti possidetis juris, the territory of Papua belongs to the Dutch East India, which become independent as the Republic of Indonesia. If the Dutch granted West New Guinea its independence, it will be an act of separatism against Indonesia. Resolution, the UN resolution. Next. On 7th, this circulated by the Secretary General to all the countries, and it was formulated in noting the acquired special autonomy for the Papua in the floating plan of Indonesia in the territory. By this, 40 countries agreed. 30 countries abstained and 12 countries not attending the UN, United States and Assembly. This is the euro that Papua belongs to Indonesia ab initio. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Freddy, for your interesting history lesson there. It was interesting to learn that, there were some explanations that still don't touch on the matter on the ground, and actually just the people's consciousness about or their awareness of the wider history of the country at the time, which was understandable due to the problem of geography. And Freddy also mentioned that, the Dutch political maneuvers have unfortunately muddied the facts that are otherwise quite clear, both de facto in the handover and de jure in the various documents that he presented for us today. So that was interesting, Freddy. Thank you for your time. Next, we have our second speaker, is Lisa May, an award-winning investigative journalist from Australia who is currently a director at the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism. Over 2 decades, Lisa has worked across newsrooms and investigative projects at ABC, SBS, Reuters, and Al Jazeera English, during which she covered Papua in 2012. Today, she will provide us with insights on the coverage of Papua from an international media standpoint. Lisa, please take it away.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank my fellow distinguished speakers who are joining me here today, and also send my support to all of you in Indonesia and beyond who are also grappling with the fight of the virus of COVID-19. Here in Sydney, where I'm coming from, we're once again in lockdown, so I send my solidarity. I want to kick off 8 years ago in late 2012 when I was working for Australia's national broadcaster, the ABC. We did a story about the West Papuan independence movement. What sparked our interest were allegations that Australian-trained counter-terrorism forces were active in Papua and allegedly involved in a suppression of the independence movement and the murder of one of its leaders. We were interested in this story because Australia was involved in the training of the counter-terrorism forces, but also because very few journalists were allowed into Papua, and that naturally sparked our curiosity and the question of why. We didn't apply for journalist visas because after speaking to many who had been refused before, we knew we would be rejected. Instead, we made a decision to go in and bear the risk of being picked up by the authorities, knowing that if we were caught, there was very little our employer nor our government could do about the situation. We planned our operation so that if any one of us were picked up along the way, we could continue with the story and gain access to it. And this was my first kind of high-risk assignment, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't afraid. I was. When we arrived, what struck me was the amount of military checkpoints everywhere in Jayapura. We met with independence leaders, including Victor Yamo, who talked about their lack of freedom to express their political views without fear of arrest or violence. And even then, Victor was resigned to his fate that in all likelihood, one day he would be arrested or even killed. Our job as journalists was for a brief moment to give voice to those who rarely had access to the international media. And we told a very human story about what life feels like from the perspective of the Papuan independence movement. What is it like to live under the threat of constant arrest? In response to the story, our Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, did say that Australian diplomats had made representations to their Indonesian counterparts, requesting an inquiry into the allegations aired by our story. To this day, I don't know if that inquiry ever happened. And as we know, Victor Yamo was recently arrested for being the mastermind of the 2019 protests. He's been charged on charges of treason, inciting violence, and social unrest. In May this year, the ABC, the national broadcaster I used to work for, reported that Indonesia had officially labelled Papuan independence fighters and members of the Free Papua movement as terrorists. Since producing this story, I've travelled on assignment and experienced some really intense conflict zones, mostly in my 2 years at the Middle East when ISIS was at its apex and in control of many parts of Syria. I was on the ground in Egypt when the Arab Spring quickly fell into a dark and violent winter. The former military general, now Egyptian President Sisi, was cracking down on dissent. I was in the courtroom of Egypt's notorious Tora prison, where the Australian journalist Peter Grester was also arrested on terrorism charges, with 2 of his Egyptian colleagues, Mohammed Fahmy and Baya Mohammed. Peter Grest is a former BBC journalist. He was not a terrorist. And I was struck by many things in that courtroom. The judge who turned up at least 2 hours late or so, always with his sunnies on. And after spending countless hours in that courtroom, it became clear to me and my international journalists that there would be no due legal process, no compelling evidence, nor justice. Peter's incarceration attracted the world's media. The courtroom was packed every time. He also had a global campaign, Journalism is Not a Crime, making waves around the world and applying pressure to democratic leaders to do something and help secure his release. How could an Australian journalist be mistaken for a terrorist? It was absurd and politically motivated. But what has never left me is in that same courtroom, in the cage next to Peter, a handful of Egyptian students also appeared. They had been protesting against the military crackdown and also arrested under terrorism charges. They were much younger, probably in their late teens, and they begged the judges to see their parents, and they shouted at us that they were being tortured. The room was full of international journalists, yet their story did not gain the same attention. Journalists inside Egypt who dared report on their plight risked being locked up alongside them. These are places where it's very, very difficult to work as a journalist, but that's why we do the job. To give voice to those who otherwise have none, to bear witness to events that shape our history and also the human race. It defines who we are as a society, the good, the bad, and sometimes the terrifying. And our job is to tell those uncomfortable stories, stories that people in power often don't want to see told, because we know that the greatest abuses of power tend to happen in places we cannot see. So what has changed in the last 8 to 10 years since I visited Papua? And I think a better question could be what hasn't. We now live in a post-truth world, a post-privacy world. When we entered Papua 8 years ago, we knew our metadata could probably be traced by authorities, but now state surveillance capabilities are incredibly sophisticated. And much of this was designed and implemented to fight terrorism. A recent investigation by the Washington Post and other institutions has found Pegasus Spyware was deployed on 37 smartphones belonging to journalists, human rights activists, business executives, and 2 women who were close to the murdered Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Finfisher is another spyware that is now in the hands of many governments with little or any transparency around the legal frameworks for how it's deployed. Even with encrypted apps like Signal, there is no longer any conceivable way a journalist can keep their sources confidential. Broadly drawn terrorism legislation that was enacted at the height of ISIS has not been unwound in Australia. This legislation also includes provisions that can significantly constrain the press. And when governments in Australia, my government, are seen to manipulate terrorism threats by introducing responsive measures that constrain the free press, label human rights activists as terrorists, trust in government is eroded. When I was in Egypt covering the trial of Peter Grester and his colleagues, I'll never forget what one of their fiancés said to me. She was a proud middle-class Egyptian woman who said, "My friends all believed that her fiancé was a terrorist." She broke down and said that, "I'm ashamed about this, but if this wasn't happening to me, if I didn't know better, I would also have believed he was a terrorist too." It's easy to believe the lie because it doesn't hurt me, but now I'm in the middle of it and everything looks different. I don't know who I am or who my people are, and I'm angry. The other thing that has changed is that information is everywhere and it's untrustworthy. And this is different and more unpredictable than traditional state propaganda. The rise of social media and misinformation poses new challenges for society. We know fake news spreads 6 times faster than true news. And for me, I still haven't fully understood or come to terms with the consequences of what we witnessed on January 6th in the United States. What influence did disinformation have on the group of Trump supporters who stormed the Capitol? And for me, it was staggering to see adults so strongly believe that the election was falsely stolen. Misinformation is also increasing the risk of an already deadly pandemic in COVID-19. We're seeing the pandemic rage on in areas where there is no belief in vaccination. It's something that the institute I work for, the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism and Ideas, is looking at in our upcoming News in Asia report. The report covers a range of topics from media ownership and the rise of fact-checking, and it delivers a couple of new insights that I'd like to share with you in its pre-release. The first is the rise of intolerant populism. Often seeded on social media, populism is a growing pressure on Asia's news media. Journalists are unsure how to reconcile the dark side of people power with their professional instinct to reflect their audience's viewpoints. At the same time, populism has cast the media as the enemy of the people. And now we find ourselves in this new and concerning paradigm. New pressures on press freedom, like we saw with the introduction of many terrorism laws. We see governments capitalising on pandemic-related measures to quell the right for free speech or assembly. There is a trend towards expanded legal mechanisms to clamp down on journalists with negative impacts for freedom of expression across Asia. And I'll finish with the news just yesterday that the first person charged under Hong Kong's national security law has been found guilty of terrorism. It's a landmark case with long-term implications for how the legislation reshapes Hong Kong society and freedom of expression there. It's troubling that 8 years ago, after my stories inside West,
5 minutes,
we see students who only months ago in Hong Kong were just that, students, happily living among their family and friends. But then they became independence leaders, and now they are charged under terrorism laws, facing years in prison. The question of just who is deemed a terrorist is one I think requires more attention. The world's story is now an Asian story, and there is an enormous amount of opportunity and good news in this. Now more than ever, journalists in the region are tasked with telling stories, not only of this Asian century, but the story that will shape our world for generations to come. How we enable journalists to access and to tell that story will play a not insignificant role in the health of our societies moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Pulisa, for that very, very insightful, report about how journalism works on the ground, and the actual task of journalism of speaking truth to power in places that cannot be seen is something that is always being challenged wherever we are in the world. In this case, in our case, I think in Papua, we do have to give some acknowledgement that there are challenges that still remain in terms of how things are done on the ground, and kind of the narrative that is being passed around. As you know, with journalism work, as a journalist myself, I think this is also something of a counterbalance, and something that perhaps the wider government of Indonesia, in this sense, can act upon. I am pretty certain that I think the foreign ministry in this case is well aware of the challenges, as we heard earlier, but this is certainly something that will continue to be improved, and we hope to be able to see these developments in the coverage that from international media and national media everywhere. So thank you for that. Our third speaker, Mr. Richard Chauvel, is an Indonesian history professor from Melbourne University in Australia. He has published a number of reports and policy papers about Papua, including a report titled Papua under the Joko Widodo presidency for Iseas Yusof Ishak Institute in 2019. Pak Richard will provide us with some analysis on what has happened in Papua and some understanding on why people have been asking or have been questioning Papua's legal status. The floor is yours, Pak Richard.
Okay, thank you very much. I will apologize for not being able to send my presentation as an email attachment, but I will try and share the content from here and see if that'll work. Otherwise, I will speak to the presentation and see how that goes.
That's all right.
If you could bear with me for a moment. So the presentation doesn't seem to be want to share. So I apologize for that and regret that. But well, I'll see what we can do under the circumstances. So the title of my talk, I have borrowed from the title of our discussion today. So let's talk about Papua, key historical and legal facts, with a subtitle of contested interpretations of those key historical and legal facts. I think what has often interested me about the contemporary conflict in Papua, by which I mean how the Papua conflict has developed in the post-Suharto period, so since 1998, is just how much history and contested interpretations of the history and the history of Papua's integration into Indonesia during the 1960s influences and frames the interpretations of the contemporary conflict by all the major stakeholders. And while while there's not, I'm not necessarily suggesting that there's total uniformity amongst Papuan political groups about the interpretation of that history of integration during the 1960s, but I think there are key elements which are broadly shared within the Papuan political community.
Sorry, but Richard, just to interject, could you please turn on your video if that's possible?
I'm trying to do that, but I'm not sure that it's. I'll try and see if I can get it to.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And do it another way. Yeah. So I've tried it once, but we'll see how we go.
Okay, we have a visual on you. Perhaps you could
you have
point the camera a bit further up. Yeah.
I think that probably the visual on me is a poor substitute for the presentation. But anyway,
that's all right, sir. We all like to.
We'll see. We'll see how we see if I can get the share some content. What do you suggest? You use screen or?
It seems like it doesn't come on screen, so I think we'd be fine looking at having you in as the visual itself.
as a poor substitute.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, here we go. We're sharing something.
Okay.
I hope we end up sharing more than my face, but we'll see how we go. So I'll just be patient for a while.
Okay.
There we go. Including this
yes
map of the island of New Guinea.
Yes.
Really to provide some historical context to the Indonesian government's recent decision to create a number of new provinces within the western half of the island. And just to make the historical point, the Papua's, the island of Papua and all the inhabitants of it, in their interaction with outside powers, have been subject to the administrative reordering of the island as a whole. And we can see here the partition agreed to by the Dutch the Germans and the English really in the name of the Australian colonies, how the island of New Guinea was divvied up in 1884. What's interesting in that is partly that having signed that partition agreement in 1884, none of those respective colonial powers did much about it. And as we know, in the western half of the island, the Dutch didn't begin to establish small administrative posts until the first years of the 20th century, and that process, and if I can put my sort of hat on as an Australian historian, one of the first, I think, the first military action of the First World War that Australia participated in was the invasion in August 1914 of that northeastern corner of the island of New Guinea, administered until for the previous couple of decades by the Germans. So there's this sort of curious history, which is perhaps important to keep in mind. If we think about how the western half of the island fits into the expansion of Netherlands control throughout the Indies, and as background to how Papua became part of the Indonesian Proclamation of Independence in August 1945, I think it's when we look at the process of geographical expansion and consolidation of Netherlands control over the archipelago, those half dozen administrative posts in Hollandia, Merauke, Manokwari, and so on, were amongst the last territories of the entire archipelago to be drawn under effective Netherlands control. So that in other words, the experience of Dutch administration by Papuan societies in what is now Papua, by the standards of the rest of the archipelago, was reasonably brief. And the interaction that Papuan societies that had been brought under Dutch control in those the first half of the 20th century was reasonably brief. The expansion of education certainly was begun, but it was fairly brief, and developed mainly to not beyond secondary school levels until the reoccupation of Papua by the Americans in 1944. So that briefness of the Papuan experience of interaction with other peoples from other areas of the archipelago, I think is one of the background factors that helps us think about the sense of otherness, the sense of difference that some Papuans feel vis-a-vis other Indonesians. Many of you will recognize this couple of photos of Imbi Square in the middle of in the middle of Jayapura, and I apologize that photograph on the right-hand side of the monument to Yosudarso and his men who lost their lives implementing President Sukarno's Trikora commands is of the old monument, not the one that was built about 10 years ago. But why I use it here is it clearly symbolizes the Indonesian governments, and particularly of the Sukarno era governments, interpretation of the struggle to reunite, to return Irian Barat to the Indonesian fold. So that in a sense represents the Sukarno's vision of Papua's integral part in Indonesia. The photo on the left-hand side.
5 minutes left, sir.
Pardon?
5 minutes left you have. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I will speed up then. It is of the building some 50 meters from Yosudarso's statue, of the building that once housed the new Khanaya Raad, so the DPR day, which was established by the Dutch in 1961, and where the Morning Star flag was raised for the first time on the 1st of December 1961. So of significant historical importance for many Papuans. And this period of the last months of 1961, I am arguing, was a pivotal changing point in terms both of the conflict between the Netherlands and Indonesia about which country had the sovereignty over Papua, and that was a fairly straightforward anti-colonial terms, and it was a conflict between whether it was newly independent Indonesia had the sovereignty over Papua as the successor state to the Netherlands East Indies, or as was agreed to under the Round Table agreements at the end of 1949, that the Netherlands had the right to continue their administration. So and that international conflict was played out on numerous occasions between 1954 and 1962 in the General Assembly of the United Nations, and it was fought out in fairly classical anti-colonial terms. Why I bring up and show you this picture of the manifesto released by the committee, the Papua National Committee on the 19th of October 1961, is that I think that this is the first occasion where a group of young Papuan nationalists declared their interest and their right to determine their own future and not let either President Sukarno or Foreign Minister Joseph Luns do it for them. So in a sense, it goes to the heart of that first generation of Papuan nationalists to determine their own future. And you can see in that quote that I've used from that manifesto, it gives you a sense of what those sentiments were. And this is a picture of I think some of the key figures in that Committee National, and I think the gentleman with the pen in his hand signing the document is Nicholas Yao, who later went on to play an important international lobbying role at the time of the New York Agreement and later Papua. So this was I think a key moment of change where Papuan nationalists asserted themselves, or asserted that they had a role in the conflict with the government of Indonesia. And it wasn't simply a matter of a conflict between Indonesia and the Dutch. This is simply a photograph of the Papuan national flag, Bintang Kejora, being presented to the then Dutch governor Platel in December 1961. And I think the way that the Dutch administration in Hollandia responded to this is important for us to think about, in as much as while certainly at that stage in December 1961, the Dutch still had a strong public commitment to the promotion of Papuan independence, where processes had been started a couple of years earlier, and in fairly concrete terms, with the establishment of the Nuria since March, April 1961. So clearly the Dutch governor of the time accepted the Nuria Raad, the DPRD proclamation or assertion that the Papuan Morning Star flag was the flag that Papuans had determined or had taken on as their national flag. And why I think that this period of time, last couple of months of 1961 and first couple of months of 1962, the next key point is how the government of President Sukarno responded to this assertion of a Papuan claim to sovereignty in Papua rather than a Dutch one. And I think it's important to say that, remember that the first of Sukarno's three commands was gagalkan negara boneka Papua. So destroy them or prevent the formation of the puppet state of Papua. So that in terms of President Sukarno's strategies, really from the end of 1949 through the end of 1961, Indonesian strategies were aimed at asserting an Indonesian claim to Papua vis-a-vis the Dutch, with the manifesto politic October 1961, that political dynamic changed. President Sukarno's opponents weren't the colonial Dutch. They were a rival group of nationalists who, Sukarno certainly didn't regard as being legitimate, but it was a very different type of political context than it had been up until then. Indonesia had been very successful in the United Nations by pushing an essentially anti-colonial arguments.
Richard, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Hopefully, we can perhaps explore your points later on in the discussion. But we have to go on.
Sorry
to
if
the
I
next
was
section.
mumbling on too long. Sorry.
No worries, Richard. This was very insightful, actually. And if I could perhaps just summarize what you said. Basically, in the beginning, Papua as an island, it was basically homogeneous in terms of its people, but nation-state borders have complicated basically the arrangement of governance. That said, international law has legitimized Indonesia's claim over the Irian Barat, but what gets lost oftentimes in the discussion is the Papuan experience itself. In these times of frequent changes of administration. So I think those are very salient points that perhaps we can explore in the discussion.
Yes.
Thank you, Pa Richard.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Our fourth speaker today is Pa Damos Dumoli Agusman, the Foreign Ministry's Director General for Legal Affairs and International Treaties. Pa Damos is an international law expert, holding a doctoral degree in law from the Goethe Universität in Frankfurt in Germany. He also teaches law in several universities in Indonesia. And today, he will close our session with insights on Papua's legal status according to the Indonesian and international laws. Pa Damos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Apparently, my job is a bit easier now because Freddy and Richard as well have explained most historical fact. So my job now is only to give legal weight to the given fact that's already being presented by the two speakers. So to begin with, I like to quote a basic understanding in international law, which a bit confusing in the public. Self-determination issue and human rights are two distinguished issues. So they are different. Human rights issue may happen anywhere in the world. Even it could happen in the so-called developed or democratic countries. So there is no doubt about that. But it would be totally wrong, and seems to be, it happened in the public space, it's totally wrong to assume that the human rights issues shall automatically give rise to the right of self-determination. So it seems to me that this is what the pro-independent groups trying to do, trying to portray. They try to twist the two in order to impress the public that both are single issue, and then ending up with the automatic call of independence. As we already aware that the call for independent or separation movement in many situations in the world always invite, or if I may say, always require and need conflict. And at the end, it will create human rights issue in order for the purpose to justify the call for independence. So that's happened anywhere in the world for the separatist movement. So I think this is the root cause of conflict in West Papua. On the other hand, I would rather to convince all of you that self-determination is an international law issue. It must be considered in that term. Unfortunately, and this is in many cases, many observers introduce the term in a very loose manner, and even without applying any legal criteria as prescribed by international law. Human rights issue, of course, should be addressed separately through its own mechanism, and no doubt about that. But my talk today, I will focus only to the issue of self-determination. And the big question posed to me is West Papua still having the right to self-determination as known to international law? And let Tharyat will deal with human rights issue or the current issue of Papua. So I will focus on this very legal issue. So I will explore some historical facts. Of course, many historical facts, whether good or bad, might be significant to the history itself, but not all of them relevant to international law. So at least I will explain what actually is in the mind of legal advisor, my colleague legal advisor, when we are dealing with this kind of issue. Right. Key legal issue that I want to make very simple here, and this is my approach is I start from the conclusions and I try to prove my conclusions. Yeah. The first key legal issue is West Papua was part of the Netherlands East Indies when Indonesia exercised its right to self-determination on 17 August 1945. The two speakers already confirmed this statement, but I will prove further about this one. And then the second legal issue is the Dutch colonial power breached international law when applying the fide impera by detaching some territories from Indonesia in the period 1945 to 1949. So this point is not very much explored by many observers, but actually this is the most important and critical critical historical fact. I will prove this later on. The third legal issue is that the New York Agreement 1962, actually it is a bilateral dispute settlement between Indonesia and the Netherlands. And I will prove that actually, apparently, it has nothing to do with self-determination in the normal term. So I quote in the normal term, because this is subject that being debated during the 1969 General Assembly. I will further explain about this. So let me revisiting the legal fact. I want to be quick on this part because the previous speaker already talked about this. I just want to jump to this 1938 point. Yeah. So when Indonesia declared independence, what is actually the constitutions that apply in the Netherlands? And it is the 1988 Constitution. What the Constitution say, it says that West Papua was included as a part of the Netherlands India. So constitutionally and legally speaking, it is evident that West Papua was part of the Netherlands East India when Indonesia declared independence. So what does it mean? So before that, I just want to make a kind of disclaimer. Indonesia and the Netherlands now has a very good relations. So when I'm telling about the history, this is only for the purpose of the history, and it's not, of course, reflect the good relation between Indonesia and the Netherlands that they enjoy now. Yeah. So before that, I just want to explain to you that during the months before the independence, there was a discussions, and I may say there's a debate in the Committee for Preparing Independence, or in Indonesia we call it BPUPKI. There was a sessions July 1945, talking about if Indonesia declare independence, where is the boundary? What was the scope of the territory to be declared independence? And there is 3 options, and they make voting for the 3 options. The first option is, this is only Dutch East Indies, and it got 19 votes. The second is, it must be Dutch East Indies plus Malay Peninsula and excluding Papua. And it got only 6 votes. And then the third option is Dutch East Indies plus Malay Peninsula, North Borneo, even Portuguese East Timor, and Papua. It got the majority vote, 39 votes. So that means this one is adopted at the committee. But what happened next? Next, when Sukarno-Hatta went to Saigon, Vietnam, and met with Japanese General Terauchi, because General Terauchi was in charge for the Southeast Asian. And then he said, General Terauchi accepted only Dutch East Indies colonial territory. So I would like to explain why that decision was taken, because there is a principle in international law, and Pak Freddy already make it very, very clear about uti possidetis juris. Uti possidetis juris mean territorial boundary of a newly independent country is the territorial boundaries of its former colony. And that means there is a kind of general prohibitions of the partitions of colonial territory. Now, I just want to focus now on the question of partitions of colonial territories that being made by the Dutch colonial at the time. So let's start with this. When Indonesia proclaimed independence in 1945, there is agreement between the Netherlands and Indonesia, step by step. First is Linggarjati. Linggarjati, de facto recognition of Sumatra, Java, and Madura. Look, this is the first partitions of colonial territory made by Dutch. Yeah. So I just want to say that Papua was not the only territory that attempted to be detached from Indonesia, but we still have another agreement here, what we call it Rainfall Agreement in 1948. There is again detachment and partitions of colonial territory. Yeah. This is the due recognition of Central Java, Sumatra, and Jakarta. And at the end, there is the Hague Agreement. Pak Freddy called it the Round Table Agreement in 1949. So then there is also another detachment of territory of Indonesia. So this is the very critical point. I just want to convince all of you that Papua was not the only territory that the Dutch colonial tried to detach. We have a lot of territories before through different agreement. Right. And then in 1956, Netherlands included West Papua in its constitutions. And by that, Indonesia then terminated the Hague Conference. So since 1959, the Hague Agreement is no longer exists. So this is from Indonesian perspective. It's already being terminated. And Indonesia is entitled to terminate that because Dutch government did not comply to the agreement itself. But the most important, finally, we found out that not only the agreement being breached, but also the right to self-determination is also being breached. This is the most point, which is I want to touch about, what we call it the Papua Paragraph. I call it Papua Paragraph because it is about Papua in the United General Assembly resolutions in 1960. 1514. This is very famous UN General Resolutions. So this is about declarations on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. So there was a paragraph 6. Yeah, paragraph 6, it says any attempt at the partial or total disruption of national unity and territorial integrity of country is incompatible with the purpose and principle of the Charter of the United Nations. This is proposed by Indonesia. And why Indonesia proposed this paragraph, this is very interesting. If you look at the statement of the head of delegation at the time, Mr. Ambassador Palar, yeah, he very clearly stated that in bringing it into draft, we have in mind that the continuation of Dutch colonialism in West Irian is partial disruption of the national unity and the territorial integrity of our country. So again, paragraph 6 is Papua Paragraph. And who enjoy the Papua Paragraph? Now we have another interesting. That's Mauritius. So Mauritius
5 minutes left, sir.
To the ICJ in 2019, it's very recently. Yeah. Historically, Mauritius is a British colony. And then in 1965, similar to Papua, the UK detached Chagos from Mauritius. And then in 1968, Mauritius got independent. And then in 2019, the ICJ say that the UK breached self-determinations on the basis of paragraph 6 of UNGA resolution 1514. So again, Papua Paragraph already being enjoyed by Mauritius when they are against the UK retaining of Chagos Island. What the ICJ says, the people of non-self-governing territory, if I may say Indonesia in 1945, are entitled to exercise their right to self-determination in relation to their territory as a whole, the integrity of which must be respected by the administrating power. So I want to quote this ruling by the ICJ that the Dutch colony at that time was wrong against the right of self-determination when they tried to make partitions of the colonial territory. That's what international law clearly stated. Right, we follow that in 1961. I don't want to focus on this because it is very clear. Dutch colony tried to put the issue on the UN list of non-self-governing territory, but it failed. And then there is a 1962 agreement. Freddy already mentioned about that. And then West Papua excluded from the Dutch constitutions in 1963 at the end. Yeah. The Dutch constitution already excluded, and it is very interesting that the Dutch excluded the West Papua even before the free choice, the act of free choice. So it's to assume that Dutch already transferred the authority to Indonesia. Yeah, and then 1969. There is act of free choice. And then this is also another interesting legal point. In the UNGA resolution 2504, it even did not refer to the resolution 5014 on self-determination. That's one important point. That means, again, the question whether it is really a self-determination become doubt in this compared to the East Timor, for example. In the resolution on East Timor, it is clearly mentioned about resolution 5014, but in West Papua there is no such reference to the resolutions 1514. And then the second most important point is even the Dutch approve. That means the Dutch as a party to the 1962 agreement has already approved it. So it is not appropriate if other parties other than Dutch try to questioning the question of 1962 agreement, because the party itself, which is directly party to the agreement, has already given the approval. So it's already finished among the party. Right, I like to make to reveal also what our foreign minister at that time stated about the New York Agreement. This is already in the New York Times in 1962. He said, very clearly he said, for the Indonesian people, this very moment, means the moment when they signed the New York Agreement, is regarded as a very important national occasion, since with the signing of the agreement, the Indonesian unity has been restored. So I quote again, the Indonesian unity has been restored. Yeah, and this is also a very legal fact that I want to show, that Indonesia interpret New York Agreement and the Act of Free Choice differently. Yeah, and most importantly, and this is also a very interesting legal finding, if I may say, how actually the United Nations interpret Act of Free Choice. Many says that the New York Agreement 1962 and the Act of Free Choice in 1969, it is only a diplomatic compromise for face-saving Netherlands. That's many historians said about that. But the most important is during the debate in 1969, leading to Resolution 2504, there is a good statement from Kuwait delegation at the time, and it's shared by many delegations. The question under our consideration cannot be regarded as an act of self-determination in the normal understanding of the term. That's what Kuwait stated. Since West Irian must be regarded as being an integral part of the sovereign state of Republic Indonesia. And this statement is being shared by many delegations at the time. That's why this is the success of Indonesia. Pak Richard said this is the success of Indonesia when dealing with the issue in the United Nations. Yeah. And it is not only state saying that, but also international legal scholar, because according to international law, views, opinion of legal scholar is also the source of law. Yeah. Rigo Sureda, for example, saying that the attitude of the UN, West Papua was regarded as an integral part of Indonesia. It's stated in his book about self-determination in disputed colonial territory. And the most interesting is James Crawford, is the late James Crawford. We miss Professor Crawford. I think Australians already known about this professor. He's a very good professor. Yeah. He said that the UN actually tried to preserve the territorial integrity under Chapter 11 of the United Nations. It's also stated in his article, The Creation of State. Right, now what Sukarno say, even before PPRA, yeah, even before the Act of Free Choice. This is in Indonesian language. Yeah. I try to put it.
Pak Damos, I'm sorry to have to intervene here. We have just run out of time for you. Perhaps we can, explore these questions and perhaps the rest of your presentation later. Okay. Let's wind down and then.
Okay, good. So great. Again, this is the last part. So what actually now the movement tried to do is about separatism. So there is a case in 1920 when Alan case, which belonged to Finland, but with the Swedish culture, tried to separate from Finland and then tried to integrate to Sweden. What the Commission of Jurists United League of Nations say, it says that positive international law does not recognize the right of national group as such to separate themselves from the state of which they form part of the simple expression of a wish. So that's to end my presentation. Thank you very much and apologize for making further time. Thank you, Pak Tama.
Thank you, Pak Damos. You've provided a very clear way, actually, to learn about the key facts of Papua's legal status from the perspective of the Indonesian government. We hope everyone is able to kind of look into the documents you mentioned and include them in their study of the actual issue itself. I think just to kind of summarize what you said earlier. In international law, in terms of international law, I think you question the fact that Papua might not actually even have the right to determination anymore because of Dutch non-compliance. That was, I guess, regarded in some ways as an act of separatism that voids the right to self-determination. That was basically your takeaway. And I think in this sense, there are certainly going to be, two sides of the story, which I think the participants here can look into on their own. But I think that basically, wraps up our panel session. And now we will begin the Q&A session. So I think we have a few questions already lined up. These are questions that have been clustered together, and there are certain questions for certain speakers, specific speakers. So I think we can just go down the list of questions that we have. So I think I'll start with the question for Freddy here by Chris Nahumarori. And he asks here whether the Indonesian government has given its utmost attention to Papua and kind of whether the infrastructure, the resources has been prepared, and that this is something that the government has made a point about doing. But then on the other side, the bureaucracy in Papua claims that they have never, they don't see, kind of the efforts, or do not experience, or they don't seem to get what part of this wealth is. So could you perhaps explain a bit, Pak Freddy, about how this is seen in the Papuan experience?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, moderator. First of all, I would like to thank all the experts of the explanation from Parisiat and so on, and especially from the ambassador. My question, I was asking by, is there any lack of the government in the development of Papua? Yes, there is. Why? The government, the central government, lack is there is no supervision, there is no coaching, and there is no mentoring by the umbrella cover the special autonomy. So the umbrella of autonomy, the government decree, peraturan pemerintah, doesn't cover all this supervision, coaching, and mentoring. So the local government, when they make their own regulation, there is a miss between the central government and the province itself. The lack of the central government is that the three items I mentioned. There is no supervision, there is no coaching, and there is no mentoring. I will say in Indonesia, so clear for the Indonesian participant, tidak ada pengawasan, tidak ada pembinaan, dan tidak ada pendampingan oleh pemerintah pusat. Sehingga perdasi dan perdasus yang lahir di Provinsi Papua maupun Provinsi Papua Barat itu tidak sesuai dengan apa yang diinginkan pemerintah pusat. Dan ini yang miss. Dan ini yang salah. Harusnya ada supervisi, coaching, dan mentoring di dalam payung yang dibuat PP, peraturan pemerintah, sehingga lahirlah peraturan daerah, perdasus peraturan daerah khusus, mau perdasi peraturan daerah provinsi, searah dengan keinginan pemerintah pusat. Jadi uang yang dikasih dalam bentuk segala macam dana otsus itu pasti disalahgunakan karena tidak ada koridor yang mengatur bagaimana implementasinya sampai ke kabupaten kota. Nah, ini kesalahannya pemerintah pusat. Lack. Tidak ada. Nah, kita harapkan bahwa di dalam undang-undang otsus yang baru, peraturan pemerintah, decree government yang keluar dari pemerintah pusat, central government itu, there must be also a supervision, coaching, and mentoring dalam hal perdasi dan perdasus yang dibuat di daerah supaya sejalan itu. Itu yang lag. Ada banyak pertanyaan, tapi saya pikir saya kembalikan ke moderator dulu sebelum saya jawab karena ini pertanyaan dari Chris Nahamori tadi, Rory, berkaitan dengan masalah banyak uang yang dikasih, tapi orang Papua tidak puas. Karena itu tadi, kewenangan khusus yang dikasih itu tidak diimplementasikan dengan baik. Akhirnya terjadi korupsi segala macam. Dan anehnya pemerintah pusat, korupsi yang begitu merajalela dari Papua, membiarkan saja. Jangan cuma wacana aja, omong doang menurut orang Papua. Tapi harus tindakan tegas. Kalau di daerah lain, korupsi bupati, gubernurnya bisa ditangkap, kenapa di Papua tidak? Itu pertanyaan orang Papua itu sebenarnya. Terima kasih, saya kembalikan ke moderator aja, singkat aja.
Thank you, Prof. Freddy. So just to translate a bit about the points that Prof. Freddy said in Indonesian, there is basically a lack of implementing regulations and supervision, or perhaps more appropriately, the training of trainers, the understanding among the people of Papua on the ground in the regional administrations there on how to correctly use or implement these the regulations that have been set out by the central government. And I think in this case, the Papuans are appreciative if they are given help in terms of governance. I hope that does not misrepresent your thoughts, Freddy, but let's go on to the next set of questions.
Okay.
We have a few here, actually, for Ms. Lisa Main. One is, the fact that there is a number of media outlets, including the ABC, the Australian Guardian.
No, moderator, excuse me, moderator. Let me interrupt you. First of all, I want to underline why the new agreement is not fulfilled accordingly to the Papuans.
Okay.
Remember, I already mentioned about the Rome joint statement made by the Dutch and Indonesian side.
Right.
There is no UN involvement in this case, and there is no US involvement as the facilitator in this case.
Very good.
The Roma joint statement is the one who changed the article 1 vote of the New York Agreement. This is between Indonesian and Dutch.
Yes.
We have to explain it to the people why the New York Agreement is not fulfilled. To the article, 1 man, 1 vote. It is changed between the Dutch and the Indonesian. by the Rome Joint Statement. It fulfilled the Rome Joint Statement, but that mutual understanding, consultation, musyawarah is the best practice for the Papuan at the time.
Very good, sir.
So it made clear. It made clear that the New York Agreement is not fulfilled. But the Dutch and the Indonesian side explained to the United Nations by artisans and all the members of the Satan and US also, that the best practice to the act of free choice in Papua is according to the best practice by musyawarah. And that is the change we have. Thank you.
Okay,
It's
thank
very
you,
important, clear
Yes.
to the Papuans that by New Agreement is not fulfilled. It is fulfilled by Rome Joint Statement that this change. So the Papuans make it clear in their head.
Very good, sir. So both the Indonesian and the Dutch side probably have more, kind of to explain to the public, to educate how this has come to be, and perhaps that is kind of what are the reasons why there are so many questions related to this, especially in the portrayal in media outlets. Stating that Papua became part of Indonesia only in 1969, are all of the legal facts there, already, contained, or are they considered? And so this is contrary, as it stands, it's contrary to the historical and legal facts that the government has showed us today. And so for Ms. Lisa Main, is there any way to remedy this kind of misrepresentation or overgeneralization of a historical fact that has many nuances? That's one question for you. And the other thing is that the state of press freedom in Papua is something that people have been bringing up over the years, and it seems that we come back to the question of how journalists or other activists or whatever can expect the kind of condition to change in Papua, or conversely, why has the case of press freedom in Papua not really advanced? If you can answer to those two, we can continue with the discussion. Thank you.
Sure. I think, in terms of the reference points of the connection and the kind of various votes, you're probably best to take those up with each independent news organization, because each journalist will have their own reference points for aligning on what they see as the facts in that case. And I can't speak on behalf of all of the media. The question of press freedom in West Papua, again, I'm not well placed to be somebody who can talk about how that is solved. That in many ways are political decisions. What I can do is just express that I see value in opening up, in having some media in places where there is trouble, because ultimately the stories do find their way out. And I guess, for me, that would just be my view, but, ultimately I'm not the person who will be deciding how the issue of press freedom is resolved in West Papua.
Very good, Ms. Lisa. Thank you for your answer. We have one question for Pak Richard, and this one is, what will be the best way to articulate and manifest this unity in diversity of Indonesia with some sort of the cross-societal engagement to show the Papuans that Indonesians are there for them? So I'm kind of trying to reiterate the question here, but I hope you kind of got the gist of it. Richard?
Good. Thank you. I think it's it is a complex process. You know, it's a 3 or 4 way channels of communication. So it's not simply the issues of communication between Papuans and other Indonesians, but Papuans with outsiders, non-Indonesians. So it's a triangular, if not quadrilateral form of communication. And I think what Lisa was talking about is an important part of this. And I think when we talk about press freedom, it's not simply a matter of, at a particular moment, foreign journalists being permitted into Papua. Given the complexities of Papua, both politically, socially, culturally, we're talking about, if we want to see any change in the way that Papua is reported, you need to think about improved access of foreign journalists over a period of years. You know, I think, you know, Lisa would be able to comment more knowledgeably than I have, but you know, certainly going, you know, thinking back of the foreign journalists who've reported well about Papua. These are people who have reported about Papua over a decade or so, by which you know, that sort of period allows a journalist or an academic to develop a basis of knowledge to interpret the particular conflicts that may emerge at one particular point in time within an historical and broader cultural context. So I think that's the sort of change that we need to be we need to be thinking about. And I think, you know, we can, you know, broaden that out to thinking about the, you know, the high quality foreign press reporting about developments in Indonesia as a whole. It is, I would argue, mainly written by journalists who have developed a long experience of reporting on Indonesia, and that probably, you know, that argument applies even more strongly in terms of Papua, because of the complexity of those societies and the, you know, the relative isolation for most foreign observers. It's going to be a time-consuming process, but I can't see it. It's not going to be solved by issuing half a dozen press visas. Yeah, it's going to be solved by a change of attitude implemented over several years.
Okay. Very good, sir. Thank you for your answer. I think we have I think we have time for one more question, and I think this one is addressed to Pak Damos. Earlier you said, sir, that, you know, the matter of international law and human rights is separate in this case. So, but there is a question, I think, from the audience here. You know, one Jihan Rafifa. If I hope I get this correct, but this is the claim to having Papua have their right to freedom as a human right. Is there something to say about that in international law terms?
Yes, of course. International law has already talked about this in many textbooks. The right of self-determination, in one hand, it's totally different with the freedom to separate, right? The right to self-determination is the positive rights, but the right to separation does not exist in international law. If you say, for example, Papua has a freedom to separate, what about Batak people? I'm coming from Batak. What about Javanese people? What about Madura people? Do they have also the right to separate? So international law has already made it clear there is another rules that counterchecks this freedom. That was what so-called territorial integrity preservation. But on the right of self-determination, this is the positive right. I mean, all people has the right to self-determination only under colonial context. That's what Indonesia did in 1945. Otherwise, if all territory are freedom to get independent, then the world will consist of thousands states. That's what not international law thinking about. Thank you, Pak Tama.
Very good. Thank you, Pak Damos. I don't know if anyone wants to comment to that. Otherwise,
if I could briefly comment
sure.
on that, and that I agree with and accept previous speakers' comments. However, if I think about the way the United Liberation Movement for West Papua and its predecessors have campaigned, particularly in the Pacific, with the Melanesian Spearhead Group, with the Pacific Islands Forums, and through Pacific Island leaders to the UN, both in New York and Geneva. I see that the issue of human rights and self-determination are intricately bound up with each other. And if we look at the sorts of arguments that Benny Wender and others have been using to promote their cause in the Melanesian Spearhead Group, is essentially arguments related to the New York Agreement, PAPERA, and broader legal moral issues of self-determination. Those arguments, in essence, really haven't changed since the 1960s. And yet they remain an important part of that international lobbying. What does change, and I would argue provides the dynamic of the UMWP's lobbying campaign, is the issue of human rights abuses. It is the human rights abuses which, according to the UMWP, continue to occur, in a sense, give the momentum and energy to the UMWP campaign. Without that, they essentially roll up in the Pacific or New York, and with exactly the same arguments as the previous years, and people are going to get bored and not pay any attention. So I think you need to think about how the issue of human rights abuses feed into and provide a momentum to the other arguments about sovereignty, rights of self-determination. The two might be legally separate. I accept that. I'm a historian, not a lawyer, but I'm really as an observer of how that campaign has been running over the last decade or more, seeing, in a sense, the human rights abuses provide the ammunition for the campaigns about sovereignty, about self-determination. Without those human rights abuses, those other arguments would fade away. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I make comment on this, Pak Tama?
Very shortly, sir, before we wrap it up.
Self-determination and human rights are two distinguished issues. When we are talking about human rights, we are very open talks about that in Geneva. because there is a mechanism in Geneva when talking about human rights. So it is no wonder why our diplomat is very tough when dealing with self-determination in New York. Because in New York, they are talking about self-determination. But in Geneva, we are open to talk about human rights. Human right abuse may happen anywhere. But I have a very hypothetical preposition here. Sometimes human rights issue fabricated by the call of independence. So if you have a dream of independence, you must create human rights issue. So I doubt that human rights issue triggered in Papua is purely human rights issue as it stands, because as many cases in the world, if you have a dream of independence, then you must create human rights issue. There's two sides of coin, if I may say, the relationship between self-determination and human rights. But the last point, denying self-determination, of course, it is human rights violations. That's what the Dutch colonial did with Indonesia in 1945. That's the relationship between self-determination and human rights. But still, the both are distinguished point. Thank you, Pak Tama.
Thank you, Pak Damos. So I think just to close this session, we have come to the end of our list of questions. I'll let everyone just kind of have some closing remarks. Perhaps Pa Freddy would like to say something, and then everyone else gets a turn.
I think Pa Agusman is right about the human rights and self-determination. But we have to remember that many authors report about the human rights, human violation all over the world, like John Andrews. John Andrews, in his book, The World in Conflict, page 24 to 245. What is he mentioned down there? The low-level conflict has led to human rights abuses by both sides, especially by Indonesian troops, including leading by some around 500,000 Papuans dead over the past half century. It means 50 years, more than 500,000 Papua dead. Those authors, I don't know where they got the data, but those data are read all over the world. And everybody read the books about John Andrews, also the United Nations. The question is, the treatment of the Papuans must be better in the future. If not, those creators of human rights violation will get the ammunition to blow up all the matters in Papua, including corruption and everything. They see this as the fact that the central government doesn't do anything related to the Papuans to save the Papuans. Actually, it becomes an international matter later on. We see at the experience of Timor-Leste, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and so on. More than 100,000, 800,000 in Rwanda, 5,000 in Yugoslavia. So this data, 500,000 in 50 years, become also the consumption of those who want to create the human rights problems. So I think Mr. Damos, Mr. Agusman is right in explanation. But we have to take, Indonesian government has to be carefully in do the problems and resolving the problems in Papua, because everything related always to human rights violation. It created by them who against the government. For me, Papua is finished. There is no talk anymore. Remember, the United Nations resolution, Yunga, if you don't mind, please slide number 11. 11.
Sorry, but Freddy, we have run out of time.
I explain this. It's very important. It's very important to, especially Papuan people, to know exactly about that. This Yunga resolution discussed the Secretary General report. They found it was wise and sensible. It was formulated in noting to acquire special autonomy for the Papuans in the development plan in Indonesia. 32 years before the Papua autonomy itself created in 2001. 1969, all the countries agreed that the development plan in Indonesia in Papua must, according to the specific condition of Papuans. Thank you. I give it back to the moderator.
Thank you, Pa Freddy. So just to give everyone a chance to have their closing remarks, I'll start with Bu Lisa, and then we'll close with Pak Tri, and then I think we can wrap that up. Thank you.
I'll be really quick, and being a journalist, I might actually finish with a question, and one that's kind of percolating in my mind after listening to this discussion, and that is, if there was to be a consensus reached on the historical facts with regard to Indonesia and West Papua, how would that change the facts on the ground and the conditions on the ground right now? And that's just a question that I'm going to leave this conversation with. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Lisa. And now we would like to give it to Pak Tri.
Well, thank you, Tama. But before concluding this very fruitful, constructive discussion, if you don't mind me sharing a slide on what Lisa and Pa Richard just referred before on the freedom of freedom of journalism in Papua. So we have a very valid data of providing access to journalists. If someone can help me sharing the screen, or I'll do it from here. Okay. Now, from 2015 to 2020, we have 2,444 applications, and out of which 92% were granted a visit and visas. So the appreciation of difficult access to this region is something that doubting. And secondly, comparing the situation in Indonesia and Papua to other countries that having serious problems in facing their freedom of expression is something that is also tend to be misleading. Now look at the visit of non-media. So we have a visit ministers, ambassadors, diplomats, and international organizations. Just a few weeks ago, a representative of ICRC visited Papua, and everything was fine. We gave them full access to visit the provinces. So in any way, Pak Tama, Bu Indah, thank you very much. And also to all colleagues in Kemlu who have made this event happen successfully. And certainly to all distinguished speakers, Pak Freddy Numberi, Pak Damos Dumoli Agusman, Pak Richard, and also Bu Lisa. I really thank you so much and appreciate your views shared with us today. And I'm sorry for those who have posed questions that have not been answered. So perhaps we need other sessions to discuss more on Papua issues. Thank you so much, Pak Tama, Bu Indah.
Thank you, Pak Tri. unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today for this very interesting and lively Q&A session. For now, I think the best is that I will let all of the discussion sink in and officially conclude this webinar. So, but before that, sorry, Richard, we don't have time for that. So I would like to conclude that by thanking you all our esteemed speakers for the contributions today, as well as the participants for their questions. But before I hand the reins back to Mbak Indah, I would like to invite her, as well as all the speakers, to turn on their video for our group picture, so that we can, kind of keep a memento of this discussion today. So everyone have their, thank you. Okay, I think we will have someone, for the administrator to actually take the picture, and I will do the countdown. We'll have 2. Okay, so 3, 2.
Freddy semakin muda.
Yeah, 3, 2, 1. Step. Okay, one more time. So 3, 2, 1. Very good. Thank you very much to all. So now, I think we can give this back to Mbak Indah to close our webinar for today. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Mas Tama. I was wondering whether calling you Bapak or Mas, but I think Mas Tama will be even better. Thank you so much for moderating our discussion today. It's been a very lively, a very frank discussion. We do have a lot of questions, as you can see. And again, as Pak Tri mentioned, we might not be able to accommodate all the questions, but we believe that the discussion have given a lot of explanation about issues related to the historical and legal fact concerning Papua. And I think even more than that, because we also discuss a lot of salient points and more current issues and information regarding the current status in Papua, as well as the challenges that we are all facing on the ground. So rest assured that the commitment of the government of Indonesia to ensure the protection and promotion of human rights, as well as the betterment of the life of everyone here, not only the Papuans, but all of us here, are fulfilled as well. So again, thank you very much for all these speakers. We really appreciate your availability today, as well as sharing your knowledge and information on so many important points. And also, of course, for all the participants, for the questions, for your active contribution in this case. And of course, not to forget the solid coordination and cooperation with Jakarta Post for convening this event together with us at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So wishing you a wonderful days ahead. Please stay safe, happy, and healthy wherever you are. And again, thank you so much. And wishing you a great day. And wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang and enjoy the rest of your day.
Selamat siang, terima kasih.
Pak Freddy Numberi, Pak Richard, Bu Linda, Pak
Freddy,
Tama.
sampai ketemu.
Terima kasih semua.
Terima kasih, Pak.
Thank you everyone.